I'm not gonna be one of those people who says, I didn't want to make this video today, here I am making one. Because I actually wanted to make this video for quite some time actually. If you want to know anything about me, is that I always like to watch really old and forgotten shows from the 2000s, but I remember they weren't anything that special in terms of quality. One of those shows of course being this Disney XD cartoon called KiD vs. KaT. You may be familiar with the show, but you're not really familiar with the development behind it, so that's something I'll explain in this video before diving into my thoughts on it. The series' pilot was first shown at MIPCOM Jr. in 2006, and it was officially revealed under the title Look What My Sister Dragged In on February 2007, where Studio B signed a development deal with YTV of the series. The show's production started in January 2008, renaming the title as KiD vs. KaT. Created by Rob Boutelier, KiD vs. KaT is an animated show that began airing on YTV 9 months later on October 25th of the same year, and a year later on February 21st, 2009 for Disney XD, but stopped airing 3 years later on June 4th, 2011. Ran a total of 2 seasons, swapping a total of 52 episodes. The series stars our main protagonist, Coop Burtenberger, a 10-year-old kid whose everyday life is fighting off a cat for an arch-nemesis from destroying their town called Bootsville, after his sister Millie brings him home and names him Mr. KaT. How original. Believe it or not, I used to be a massive fan of the series when I first saw it back in 2011. That was when I was 7 years old, and I always thought it was a funny show with memorable characters. But the older I got, the more I started to realize that the show wasn't as admirable as I made it out to be. It wasn't the complete opposite, but it wasn't anything above average. Now I know people are gonna say that this show has a striking resemblance to Invader Zim, which to me is really stupid because I fail to see the comparisons between these shows. You could argue that it's because they both involve two characters fighting each other all the time, but that would work if they were the only two characters that have done that. Plus we've seen shows like Dexter's Laboratory doing the same kind of trope between Dexter and Mandark. However, in my opinion, how this trope was executed in KiD vs. KaT wasn't all that bad. It was just really cliche, with Mr. KaT trying to take over the world and Coop trying to stop him. Alongside Coop is his best friend Dennis, a young kid who lives with a high-tech family who seems to be smarter than Coop. Throughout the entire series, Coop is trying to make everyone, including his own family, to believe him that Mr. KaT is an evil alien. But his many attempts to do so always tend to fail, and he's seen as a normal cat to Bootsville. Especially Millie, who he seems to have an affection towards despite being so evil. Speaking of affection, this show has some of the most stale relationships I've ever seen in any show ever. I'm fairly sure that it's not the show's strongest point, but that's no excuse for how poorly they portray them. For example, we never really get to see why KaT hates Coop and Dennis other than the fact that they know his secret identity. But it literally happens because Coop and his family were playing cat, and when Millie throws the ball at the forest, Coop finds the ball near one of the bushes. And when he goes to pick it up, he notices Mr. KaT peeking from the bush before growling at Coop, causing the latter to flee in fear. Once again, despite it being shown in the first episode, it leaves no ambiguity for the rivalry other than he's an alien and no ordinary cat. Not even the series finale gave much explanation on why KaT is the way he is on being evil, although it did reveal his real name, which is Agent 27B. So that's something, right? Now, does this mean that their relationship is forced? Far from it. In fact, it was probably the most entertaining dynamic of the show, and there really isn't a complicated history between these two. KaT wants to take over the world for world domination, and Coop must stop him. Again, not a bad concept for a kids show, but the other relationships in the show don't really compare between the relationship between Coop and KaT, but are still okay, other than Coop's relationship with Dennis, as the latter being the only one who believes Coop of KaT being a menace and tries to help him no matter what. I don't know, I always got a Sonic the Hedgehog vibe watching the show, with Coop being like Sonic, who's the big hero but a bit of a show-off at times, Dennis being like Tails with being a science nerd at all, and Mr. KaT being like Robotnik, who every day comes up with schemes to try to destroy Coop once and for all. Speaking of which, how are the characters? Well, they're kinda alright, with the best characters being average and the worst characters being from mediocre to downright annoying. First we have Coop. He's your average 10-year-old kid who wants the world to believe him that KaT is an evil alien, but always ends with everyone thinking he made it all up. It sort of feels overdone because we've seen this type of trope before in shows like My Goldfish is Evil, which keep in mind came out 2 years before KiD vs. KaT, and the purpose in that show was similar, with the kid named Beanie trying to prove to everyone that his goldfish Bubbles is evil, hence the title. But pushing that aside, he's a decently written character seeing as he's clearly the one who saves the day in every episode. And it's nice how they got Aaron Matthews to voice him, and later on she would go ahead and voice for other shows, such as Geronimo Stilton, Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures, and Super Monsters. Also, I just want to point out that Coop's hair literally reminds me of Butch Hartman when he's designing for Timmy Turner and Danny Phantom. I thought that was a neat thing to point out with his design. Next we have Dennis, who once again is the techno geek of the show who helps Coop out in need and is almost always by his side whenever things go wrong for the two of them, even though he doesn't have that much heroism inside of him unlike Coop, but for the most part, he's alright. Then we have the show's main antagonist, Mr. KaT, who once again wants to destroy Coop and take over the world for his own benefit, but is thwarted by Coop constantly in every episode. As a kid, I always thought he was the best character of the show, but I was so focused on how neat his design was. So while Mr. KaT may be my favorite character of the show, I can't really say the same thing for his owner Millie. Now, a number of shows have written spoiled little girls, but for the most part, they've written them very well. Characters like Brianna from Cake Patowski and Susie from Phineas and Ferb are examples of bratty girls done right. Then you take a look at Millie, and it's the complete opposite of an entertaining spoiled little kid. Millie's gimmick in the show is that if she doesn't get what she wants, she unleashes a mighty scream that's more than enough to make the entire world collapse. And they could have easily changed that. Instead of being this non-stop prick who yells all the time, she could have been portrayed as someone who would blackmail someone for not getting what she wants. And I know the previous two examples I brought up have done this trait where they yelled for things not going their way, but the writers never went overboard with that trait and didn't make them yell to cause a fucking thunderstorm. There's also another trait of Millie, and that's the fact that she's basically good at everything that she does. She's basically a jack of all trades is what I'm trying to put out. I wouldn't really mind this as a part of her character if the writers didn't make her have a huge ego about it and also shitting on her brother and father for not being like her. Anyways, I've rambled on about Millie, but I do believe that she's an extremely flawed character that's completely pretentious. Now, I would talk about the other characters like Mrs. Munson, where her entire character is that she hates children, especially Coop. But like Mr. KaT, there really isn't any exposition on why she hates him so much. There's also another character named Fiona, who appeared in the Season 2 premiere and was added solely to be Coop's love interest, despite the fact that we had another character who was also someone for Coop to be with. That, of course, being Phoebe.
Phoebe! Stop that! Hi, Coop!
Again, the rest of the characters don't really have much things that need to be said, so I guess we can move on to the episodes. When it comes down to a forgotten cartoon, there aren't really that many good episodes. The worst ones are just whatever. That's not to say every episode of KiD vs. KaT is awful. There were actually a number of episodes I genuinely enjoyed. An example would have to be Season 1's How the Test Was Won, where Coop realizes that his grades have been falling down due to him fending off KaT, but he believes he'll get his grades back up once he aces that science test. I like this plot a lot. It basically deviates from the usual episodes where KaT plans an evil scheme, and I know some other episodes do that where it has nothing to do with taking over the world, but they handle that extremely well here. And speaking of other episodes, I don't know if it's just me, but I think I'm Okay You're a Cat might be my favorite episode of the entire show. The plot in that episode is that Coop got his homework shredded again by Mr. KaT, and after another attempt at convincing his dad that the cat did it, Bert gives Coop a tape to help him think positive. We see him go through all these phases, from being positive to being negative and finally to being tough. Once again, this wasn't no ordinary Coop and KaT fighting episode, and although Mr. KaT was obviously the one messing with the tape, Coop at the end took responsibility for what he did. I don't know why, it's just something different than the usual "I didn't do it, the cat did" bit. I also enjoyed the ones where Coop and KaT are working together to defeat a greater evil. I know it deviates from the usual dynamic of just being at each other's throats, but it's always nice to see them work out their differences than going back to being mortal enemies. However, if you were to ask me which is the worst episode of the show, it would have to be Nuff Said, where after another day of defeating Mr. KaT, Coop is deemed a threat to Bootsville for saving their lives. I hate this plot a lot because not only is it mean-spirited towards Coop, but we've seen him save the planet numerous times before this episode. I get that not all kids shows should be all sunshine and rainbows. Even Phineas and Ferb have unlikable characters. But there's one episode I found interesting to see, and it's the episode UF Float, where after the gang builds a UFO for the parade, Mr. KaT steals it, and while it may seem like he was gonna attack Bootsville, towards the end it was revealed that he wanted to get back to his home planet, which we got to see more in Season 2 where he develops a relationship with a Russian cat. Honestly, I thought it was interesting to see more of Mr. KaT's character, because the earlier episodes show him as nothing more than an alien feline, so I'm glad the later episodes were able to show his true colors. So while a couple of the episodes of the show are good, the animation for the rest of this series is not something I can entirely praise. Now, Studio B was responsible for shows like Littlest Pet Shop and Pound Puppies. However, the show I thought about when watching KiD vs. KaT when it came to its animation, and I say this as a non-brony, is My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. I don't know why, again, I was only 7. The animation in KiD vs. KaT for the most part isn't anything too special, and the only time I even cared for it was during its fight scenes. In the end, KiD vs. KaT is a show that, while it has been forgotten for such a long time since it ended, it's still pretty average. But I guess I should answer my own question: why was this show so forgotten? Well, I guess it's because it hasn't been talked about that much even when it started airing. But I suppose it's due to how forgettable the characters are and how uninteresting they can be. But I don't think people such as myself would call this an abomination. I'm aware that Rob Boutillier didn't have any plans for a 3rd season, but honestly it's for the best knowing the show had a series finale. Whether you liked it or hated it, still had an ending. It wasn't like every other old cartoon where they just get cancelled. However, if the show were to come back, then hopefully it'll be in the form of a movie. Even if it doesn't do well in rating, it's better to do that than rebooting it entirely, as most reboots of old TV shows are never that good in terms of quality, except for Animaniacs. It was alright.